Okay, so main topic item for this week, we wanted to talk about some of the goings on about DC. I'm completely in the dark, so this is you going to
Yes.
be me giving me some information, then we'll talk about what we think about it.
Yeah, and I don't actually think so. There was a press event to do with DC a few nights ago with the heads of DC now, James Gunn, director of things like the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy, the Suicide Squad, stuff like that. And he's now the head of DC alongside Peter Safran, who's another human being. And they sat down and spoke a bit about the future plans for DC. Different sources vary slightly on like things they've said, on what they've implied. A lot of news headlines are kind of taking certain ideas and running with it. For example, that it's not Matt Reeves is the Batman with Robert Pattinson is not the same universe as Superman. But then James Gunn seems to have in other articles not quite said that. It seems to me more like he's waiting to see how Superman does before Matt Reeves agrees to that. Um, so essentially, we have some new information about the state of DC. But first, I kind of want to get a gauge from you. What what state do you see DC in at the moment, in its
Well,
current state?
what one thing I get really annoyed about is, and you see it a lot on social media and some of the other stuff, is where people have got this absolute desire for people to just replicate what they've done in the MCU, and I don't think that's actually the answer because I was explaining to you before about some of the comic reading and stuff like that. I love the way some of the DC can be able to do some bits that are almost kind of quite self-contained. What does frustrate me is inconsistency. So
Hmm.
Aquaman and other people popping up in Peacemaker, the Peacemaker being part of if you're going to do something, commit to it. The Batman I thought was absolutely brilliant, really good. The tone of it very different. There's a risk that you're then going to try and bring that into a bigger world, and actually you lose the essence of what it really is. I love Batman.
Yeah.
Batman's one of my favorite characters. It's the thing that got me into reading comics. I think it was about 2008. Read, some of the Frank Miller stuff, Dark Knight Returns, most people's kind of opening, kind of first comic to read. Absolutely loved it. Batman
He
Year
was
One,
mine as well.
absolutely brilliant. But some of that ability to be able to do some one shots and some solo stuff's really good. So I don't think the answer is always replicate the MCU, but chaos is also the thing to avoid. And I feel that's where the lack of understanding and confusion about what's going on, I think, is the big problem. Just commit to something, be consistent, have a strategy. Doesn't need to be Marvel strategy, but have a strategy, and that's what annoys me.
No, I completely agree. I've expressed to you a lot about my opinions on this new DC universe. There's still quite a lot of sore parts of the internet that are still sore over the Snyder universe kind of being left and done. In my eyes, it should be done. It caused so much harassment online, and like it's so unbelievable that Hollywood allowed something like the Snyder Cut to be made. That's never been done before. That is the win. Like, and I really wish that's where it ended. It's like, look, you won there. Like the fans, you won. You got that, and I love that 4 hour
Yeah,
epic. It's
really
an
good.
amazing film, and it totally, to me, fixes the many issues I have with the theatrical release of Justice League. But I agree, it should have stopped there. It just, it was a
People
shame
need to be
that,
able to move on, don't they? There's an element of take the win. We got a conclusion for something that we didn't have before.
yeah,
It now needs a new era of something new.
yeah, and it was a real shame that they kind of took that victory of the Snyder Cut, and a lot of corners of the internet kind of went, well, now we need to get the sequel Justice League, and it's like, no, 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 that's not going to happen. Let's be realistic. Anyway, since then, James Gunn has come and taken over, and I really wish that he did a hard reset of the DC universe. However he wanted to do it, however which way, I just wish he did a full reset and it was a new universe with entirely new actors and cast. Unfortunately, what's happened is this weird mesh of continuity where all our Justice League and Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman, our core trinity of the DC universe, are now different, and that never happened. However, because James Gunn made the Suicide Squad, he wanted to keep the events of that in, and he made the Peacemaker show, and he has a season 2 coming out. But then the events of that tie into the events of the Justice League and Batman v Superman. So how have they happened if the past Man of Steel hasn't happened? Because we now have David Cornsweet coming in this year as Superman in James Gunn's Superman that he's directing. One of the, probably, I think, the highest anticipated film of the year. And I personally, like you, loved Matt Reeves' Batman. I would have wished they build off from that universe, and then maybe in a few years introduce a Superman in that universe. And I think James Gunn is kind of holding to try and connect it, because I know you haven't watched this, but recently, technically the first thing in James Gunn's new universe, he states, is the new animated Creature Commandos show, which showcases the world where Superman this year will take place. And that show is heavily reliant on building off the things that happen in the Suicide Squad movie. And it's very confusing. Like, one of the main characters is Rick Flag Sr., the father of Rick Flag, who they talk about how his son died in the Suicide Squad, and yet he's going to be in the Superman. Rick Flag Sr. So it's all connected, but it's all not. And that's what I think is confusing, especially for general audiences. You and me were heavily into this culture of understanding these films and the comics. So even we can forgive it to an extent. But that's not what makes a movie successful. It needs wide range appeal. And if people don't really understand what's going on or what they need to know, then I find that disheartening, and it feels aimless. That's the issue with this. To me, it feels aimless.
Question though, do we actually care more about it? And do people go? Some of the people going to watch these films, do they just not even give a crap? They're just like, who cares whether or not we know them or whether they connect? There is a question about, do we care about it too much? Is a question as
Yeah,
well.
but I would argue that Infinity War and Endgame, and I know you said you don't want them to copy necessarily what the MCU did, because I do think in essence that is kind of like lightning in a bottle what happened there. But Infinity War and Endgame was so successful and are so beloved because they pay off 10 years of films. And a large criticism for all the films since then in this Infinity Saga, and why it's not doing as well, both critically, commercially, is, I think, how things now feel disconnected and don't necessarily make sense sometimes. And there's not a clear timeline. Also, some of the main characters introduced in the MCU are not absent, and they seem to just be focusing on newer characters, which maybe isn't gelling as well. But I just think there's a lot of lessons from past DC and current MCU that James Gunn can learn. So
Even
let
past
me,
DC, like for example, Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. There's almost a sense to me that, look, you don't try and replicate a 25, 26 film kind of run that you've got in the MCU. Just start with something that's a really compelling enclosed story that you might do over a small number of series of films, and then commit to that, and then that's the kind of jumping off point, isn't it? But it's really hard to do that when
yeah.
you are going to have people who are going to say, how does this connect to stuff? Just do a hard reset. I mean, it was
Mm.
not rocket science. New people coming in, a new opportunity, a new Superman. Just do a hard reset. But they haven't done that. And I think this is the thing that's going to be a frustration. I don't know about the new Superman. It looks okay. David Cornsweet looks like an absolutely brilliant Superman, and I think there's a lot of love for Henry Cavill. Great, but he looks like he's going to be a really good Superman. The film looks a little bit crazy from the trailer, but what you don't want marring that is just confusion around how things connect. Just, it. Hopefully, that is a really good kind of jumping off point. But
Yeah,
um,
and you'd imagine it
there's
would be. It's
concern.
Superman.
Yeah,
It's Superman, and I think that's part of the issue with the craziness is like, oh, James Gunn is writing a Superman film which is set in a world that's already filled with these superheroes of mostly like Justice Society members and stuff. You know, you got Guy Gardner, Green Lantern, Hawk Girl's in this, Mr. Terrific. You know, most audiences probably don't know who these characters are. We do.
Mm.
But it's a very, I'm scared it's going to be a very cluttered movie for what James Gunn has said is going to harness the core being of Superman. And I don't know if that necessarily needs a lot of superheroes around. Um, but I'm still excited for the film. Obviously, we're still going to see it. But that kind of gets into what they were saying at this press event. And I think this is where we're going to differ. So it seems like the majority of what they've been saying, this is the gist I personally get, is that they're favoring pitches and stories that they're getting pitched as really amazing stories, and that's why they're choosing them. So for the most part, James Gunn and Peter Safran, they've had directors like Luca Guadagnino and stuff who directed Challengers last year, which was one of my favorite films of the year. And they've come to them and given a pitch for the film that they want to do, or they've written a script draft for a film that they want to do. And when that's really exciting to them, they've said yes, and that's why they're doing that film. And so their focus is that it's for the creatives, and it's not just a film in terms of commercial value, but instead when there's a real passion, artistic passion behind it. And I think that's where you're going to favor agreeing with that. I personally disagree with that idea. I think there's a need to be a bit of a producer here and look at it from a building a world perspective, because as we get into this, I'll say what films we've got coming, but there's going to be a solo Clayface movie. There's going to be a Swamp Thing movie, a Bane and Deathstroke team up movie, a future half animated, half puppet dynamic duo movie where the dynamic duo is Dick Grayson and Jason Todd, where they're both Robin, which I have a lot of angered thoughts on, but we won't get into that. And so it seems like it is this mess. And James Gunn, instead of building up to, say, an Avengers, a Justice League, he's building up to this big Endgame event almost with just this big mass of superheroes. And maybe that'll work. We don't know yet. I just have concerns. And so what they've said in terms of output, and this is the first major point, is that DC Studios is aiming to produce 2 live-action films and 1 animated film per year. And this was according to Safran, who also added they're targeting 2 live-action and 2 animated series for Max streaming service per year as well. So that's 2 live-action films, 1 animated film, 2 live-action shows, and 2 animated shows per year. That's a lot.
That is a lot of content, especially if those things are not going to be well connected. I do agree with you on the connection point. I think you can tell really good stories in isolation without them all being an amalgam. They don't all. They could be in the same world. They don't have to be this kind of plan that there's going to be a big coming together of everything. But bringing it in the same world actually makes a lot of sense, because there is a lot of learning as well from the Sony universe of films that have not done well,
Yes.
with kind of not great characters. You know, your Morbius and some of those haven't landed that well.
And
Yeah,
I'm scared it might be going in that pathway,
yeah,
because a large issue with that is you're giving these solo movies to what are Spider-Man supporting villains or characters, and there's an idea where that may work. The first Venom did really well, and that is like the character that's arguably most connected to Spider-Man. But then because that was successful, they kept pumping these out, and the only promise that any of us would ever go to these films for was maybe they'll tease that Spider. They can't possibly do another one of these Spider-Man villain films and not have a Spider-Man, or not tease a Spider-Man. But they did, and they kept doing it, and it was a mess. And so I worry that, well, if they're making a low budget horror like Clayface movie, is Batman gonna show up? And if not, then who is it really for? Like,
Yeah,
I don't think that's going to attract a large audience. And with so many things that they're saying they want to come out in a year, it feels like they're very much rushing to a finish line that's very undetermined.
yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So what were the other points from the press conference?
Yeah, so I've mentioned that they're working on a Clayface movie, um, which Mike Flanagan pitched, which they really loved. Um, as well as that, they talked about they're working on a Bane and Deathstroke team up film. What does that make you think of?
Well, my first thought was I hope Bane has a normal voice in that. in that.
I, for one, don't.
Again, it's just the best thing about Bane was the storyline about how he broke Batman's back, and
Mm.
that was the hook. I'm not sure how much of a hook Bane is without Batman. It's the same thing as what you just said. You know, how Craven the Hunter, how good a character is Craven the Hunter without Spider-Man, and without those, and it's difficult because those characters that we absolutely love that are big drawing. I think what will happen is you might have a film that's quite good, it might be quite creative, it won't have a pull in to the audiences, and therefore it won't be successful, and it'll seem like a failure. We want these films to be successful. We love the kind of creative storylines. We like some of those characters to come out that aren't just, we don't just want films that are just Batman, Superman, and others, because we've got really good characters, haven't they? But it's just all about whether or not they're good stories, good concepts delivered in the best way possible and
Yeah,
aren't disjointed.
and do you know what I think it is as well? It is largely that as comic book fans, we are used to reading a mixture of stacks of different comic storylines. And I don't think that can necessarily be translated to the movies where we're in an economic crisis where people just don't go to the cinema as much. When there's an oversaturation of content, of really good content on streaming and in the cinema, where there's a lot to watch. And so there being these other like standalone Peacemaker season 2 and Clayface and these obscure characters. Yeah, for comic readers, it's easy when there's a Two-Face comic to just pick up a Two-Face comic alongside the rest of your stack of comic books and just to try it out. It's not the same when approaching a TV show, and I don't think it's the same in terms of an audience going, I really like Batman. Oh, there's a Riddler show. No, I'm
That
giving that
being
a
said,
miss.
Penguin series, to be
Yeah.
fair, but again,
However,
that
they
Penguin
established
series would not have
Penguin
happened because of the Batman. You couldn't have
exactly.
had that series without the success of the Batman. But I mean, brilliant, brilliant
But personally,
series,
yeah,
really
if
good.
they do with they slated that the Batman seems to be being pushed to possibly 2027, which is a real shame. But as long as it's good when it comes out. But I would really like the idea of, say, if we have Mr. Freeze as the villain of the next Batman film,
We bring Arnold
having
Schwarzenegger back. No,
no, okay,
no,
no, that
okay,
wasn't
maybe
quite what I
not.
was thinking. Still ingrained in my
I
brain.
thought you were onto something then, but no.
Yeah, okay, maybe I keep talking and you regret. No, no, but is that we have like the Batman 2, and then a villain that we meet in that, either Mr. Freeze or someone else, has their own serialized villain show. Because that really worked really well for the Penguin. Uh,
And great
s
example where one of my favorite kind of um, spin-off kind of comic storylines was Batman White Knight by
mm.
Sean Murphy, where you had that kind of backlog story of Mr. Freeze. Really good, bit of a different take on it, completely different kind of thinking about how we do it. So I agree, it could absolutely work.
But I think doing a Clayface movie before there's a Batman movie is a bit insane. We also have Superman currently in editing. You know that's coming out this year. They also said Supergirl is currently going through production, and so that's going to be based off from what we've seen, the Woman of Tomorrow storyline. Have you read Woman of Tomorrow by
I
Tom
haven't.
King?
I do think we're gonna have to set each other through this podcast some reading challenges.
Yes.
I've got a few for you, but yeah, I think that one needs to be on the list for me. I've not read that yet.
Yeah, so essentially, Woman of Tomorrow is a very like standalone good story about the character of Supergirl, and it really highlights very well what makes Kara Zor-El different to her cousin Kal-El, Superman. And the fact that, and it goes into the fact that she remembers Krypton being destroyed. She was older when she was there, like she has memory of it, and that brings trauma and anger with it that the ever hopeful and kind Superman doesn't have. And essentially, it follows the perspective of this random woman, an alien, who encounters Kara, whose father's killed by this villain, and the whole story is this girl and Kara going on a quest to get revenge or to bring to justice this guy. And through that, they encounter different like societies and journey with each other, um, in terms of like what it means to kind of be Supergirl and stuff. And I think it's a really nice story. Personally, I found it to drag slightly. Tom King, he's an amazing writer. We know that. One of the best comic writers. He does sometimes like to waffle for long pages about things, and I found that very evident in Woman of Tomorrow. The art was lovely. Um, also goes into a bit more how Supergirl's slightly more younger and naive than Superman is. But for the show, and to adapt it into a film, there's a few worries, especially with films like the Marvels, which are very female centric, not being very successful. It just seems that, especially at this point in time, outside of Wonder Woman, solo led female superhero films without a really strong male supporting cast are gonna struggle, with the majority of audiences being male. And especially with the characters in the show, there's essentially only these three characters, and the villain, who is a dude, forgot his name. He's not that important. I never found him that interesting, which was another issue with the story. Um,
So it's
he
very, so
only
it's
really shows
very
up in the
close.
end.
It seems like it's going to be very closely aligned to the comic book.
However, that said, they announced recently that Lobo will be in this film,
Oh, okay.
who wasn't in it originally, played by Jason Momoa, who played Aquaman.
That
Which
make casting makes sense in terms of the look.
mm, I
It's
think
just
he
going to confuse the hell out of people,
exactly.
especially if
I
Lobo just goes swimming. It's going to
if I see
really
him
confuse people. He's
into
going to have
water once.
no swimming kind of rule for that one.
See, I think the Jason Momoa as Lobo is like perfect casting. Like he is Lobo, even just as a personality. My
Yeah.
issue with that is his version of Aquaman is the same. Is also just Lobo in a way. So I don't know how he's going to differentiate that massively. I think bringing on a really strong male role like Lobo is really smart though for the film. We're going to see how that goes. That's kind of all the information we have on that.
Do we
Peacemaker
have the
season
actress?
2.
Do we know? Do we know who the actress is going to be for
Yes,
Supergirl?
we do.
This is me putting you on the
Um,
spot.
yeah,
What is it? New coming
she was
actress
recent.
or?
No, no, no. She was in House of the Dragon. She
Oh,
played
okay.
main the main lady in that. It is Millie Alcock. Yes, I can remember her name. So Millie Alcock is playing Kara Zor-El. She was in House of the Dragon season 1. She's does amazing in that role.
Let's not start
Um,
talking about that because you'll be talking about it for
Yeah.
ages.
Oh, Krem of the Yellow Hills is the villain from the comic, who's apparently going to be played by Matthias Schoenaerts. I don't know if I definitely butchered this pronunciation there. But yeah, so that's the state of Supergirl. Peacemaker season 2, we know that's been coming along for a long time. That's wrapped filming. Apparently, it will come out in late August, so that's done. I mean, sure, I'd like Peacemaker season 2. I kind of don't need it to connect to everything else.
No.
Just do it for the people who like season 1 and just have it as a continuation of that. But you never know with James Gunn. We talked a bit about Clayface. Um, James Watkins is apparently in negotiations to direct it. And it was pitched very much as an amazing body horror film that reveals a compelling origin of a classic Batman villain. Clayface is not as widely known as Penguin or Joker, but we think his story is equally resonant and thrilling and frankly even more terrifying. And that's kind of all we have on that. Very much
Also,
seem
very, very difficult character to play against in the Talisman Batman version of that game.
Oh, we need to have an episode of this podcast just talking about board games.
We maybe we
Oh, that would
do.
be good.
We do.
Mm.
We do. We yeah.
But speaking of Batman villains, it then took them on to discussing Brave and the Bold, which is their future Batman title, which is apparently in active development, with a script currently being written. Gunn says he's working very closely with the writer on Brave and the Bold, and apparently it's really good so far. He seemed, to me, from everything we've seen, spoken very little about Brave and the Bold, which is strange because I do think if you're going to kick off a DC universe, you kind of need your Trinity there, but they don't seem to be doing that. And I think that's largely because he's trying to get the all good from Matt Reeves to have Robert Pattinson be the Batman of his David Cornsweat Superman universe. The only issue is he wants to follow with Damian Wayne, and the issue is with the idea of bringing in an old Batman is that I don't know if an old Batman who's had Nightwing and Jason and Tim and Damian as Robin works with David Cornsweat, who looks like a very young Superman, who actually to me looks perfectly on par to stand next to a Robert Pattinson Batman. Like they look, if you've seen images of them as Superman and Batman,
Yeah.
they look like they would be in the same universe. They look like contemporaries. I don't want a Superman that is a lot younger in his career, but we have an old Batman with with all these Robins and stuff already. That just feels very disjointed.
It does. It does.
And
I
then
agree with
if we
that.
get a Batman Superman fight, I'm gonna feel bad for Batman because Superman's just gonna be beating up an old man.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I do like the kind of Batman dynamic where he's slightly older, but I agree with you. That's really difficult if you've got quite young. And the other thing as well is what's the longevity of some of these films? If this is a series that goes on for say 10 years, you also don't have it where those actors are going to age in that time as well. So you got to think about the kind of longevity of the and how long it takes to make the films. And I know they're talking about a lot of films in a lot of short space of time there, but it just needs to be thought about, doesn't it?
Yeah, I understand the impulse of wanting to get to a DC universe where we have like all these amazing characters. Part of the great thing about reading comics at the moment is that you can jump from Batman and it connects to Nightwing, my favorite comic character, amazingly written character. He's a great run. Especially Tom Taylor's run that he recently finished. And Nightwing to me is the core of the DC universe. And it seems like DC Comics are kind of making that the thing at the moment as well. He's very much the center of all the main stories and stuff, which I love to see. But it's really difficult for, if you think of general audiences, have we ever seen a true Robin except, when George Clooney adopts an adult? Like, aside, we've never had an actual young Robin before. And so we'll be going into a film where we go, oh, not only is this Batman's son Robin, but there's been like 3 or 4 more before that who have all had these other storylines. And because of that, you're glossing over these really impactful, good stories. And
Yeah.
you kind of, and then it's just incoherent. As well as that, they talked about Swamp Thing, which is a movie they're working on by James Mangold, who's taking headway on it. They've not said anything much about it. It just seems like people are very excited for what this Swamp Thing movie could be.
Love the
Um,
idea of that. One of our kind of bargain comic purchases was the original Swamp Thing, Alan Moore. Love some of the original Alan Moore work. Absolutely brilliant. There was a TV series, wasn't there, about Swamp Thing? I never watched that, but there is something about that could be amazing.
yes. So that's where I kind of differ personally, because I do think the Swamp Thing, even though it could be a really brilliant film, I don't know if it would be commercially successful. I don't know how many people would be interested in seeing a Swamp Thing thing. Another uh, DC thing in production as well is Dynamic Duo. We've touched on that very slightly. Described by Safran as a coming of age crowd pleaser. I hate the idea of this film.
Is that
Oh
the
my
two
gosh.
Robins? Is this the two Robins
Yeah.
one?
So
Okay.
there's just, I don't know how James Gunn, who seems to be like the major DC fan, the big comic book fan that's running DC at the moment, can agree to this film if he all cares about the Batman lineage. Not only are they calling it Dynamic Duo, a film where neither of the duos is Batman, even though iconically the dynamic duo is Batman and Robin. No, this is about two Robins, right? The first Robin, Dick Grayson, who then would later become Nightwing, and then Jason Todd, the second Robin, who would later die kind of and come back as the vigilante Red Hood. However, this film has been described as them both being Robin in a coming of age story. Which, okay, if you could easily pitch me on a Nightwing and Red Hood team up film. That sounds awesome to me. But you're saying that this is a film about two Robins that are Robin at the same time, where the idea of Robin is quite a lonely one because it's important how he's partnered with Batman. And the whole character of Jason, his whole downfall in his aggression and why he ends up ultimately kind of dying for a long time is because he can never live up to the ideal that was set by his past Robin. And what's more is the animation studio that is making this film make these weird animated puppet looking animations. I couldn't be happier at the idea of a Robin film, and this just does not excite me in any way.
But it's probably not been written yet, and there might be hope. You just don't know.
Yeah, it seems to be
I
far
agree
away
with
and
you.
you
It
stay
doesn't.
far away.
Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense. Really, Robin's Nightwing only really in media have been touched on in the Titans, Teen Titans, haven't they?
Mm.
Really. Um,
Yeah, and I would argue that Titans. Oh, and that's another thing that they're working on reportedly is a Titans movie, as well, which could be really good. However, I think a lot of the idea of Titans is that they're dealing with the fact that they're trying to be heroes in their own right because they're just considered to be sidekicks. And so if we have a
yeah.
Titans, Teen Titans, before we have a Justice League or an adult superhero team, how do we get that message across? You're just premiering the superhero team to be these younger kids like Nightwing, and that also leads to this rumors of a possible Starfire. They had a little title called a Starfire animated show where she's flying about the galaxy as well, which very much seems like, and I know you haven't seen this show, I've only seen snippets of it, but She-Ra, which is just this little animation kind of badassery serialized action comedy animation thing.
You mean
Um
you talk about She-Ra? Is there a new series of She-Ra? She-Ra.
oh yeah, they made like a recent reboot kind of show.
It's 80s, absolute 80s cartoon in the world of He-Man, don't you?
No.
There's this new information. Oh, this is exactly where the kind of dad teaching comes into She-Ra
Hence
80s
why we made the
80s
podcast.
80s story, similar to kind of absolutely classic He-Man, what I grew up on in the 80s, early 90s. Yeah, She-Ra's classic character in the world of He-Man.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, she had recently had a like an animated, more young adult, like more kids show, to be honest, where it's just her alone, kind of going out on this serialized kind of action comedy. Imagine like Cartoon Network, but a bit more mature.
What platform is that on?
And
Because
so
is
this
that on? Because obviously Netflix did He-Man
Netflix, I
series.
believe.
I think it might be tight. There might be tied in some way to the He-Man, because they always were originally. When I was younger, there was
Well,
always a case of, does He-Man go out with She-Ra? I think there was a view that they might do, but I'm not sure. So I wonder
it
whether they
may
might bring it together.
it may possibly that there is a current Masters of the Universe Netflix show on Netflix. The animation's like completely different though, so I don't think they tie in, and they're very different like tones. And from what I've seen, neither of them are very good. I did watch the first season of Masters of the Universe, and it was a bit of a letdown. And aside from that, I think that's pretty much everything covered. There's a lot, and I think largely why none of this information really trended a lot online is because this was just a big spout of just lots of maybe information and ideas that DC are working on, and so there wasn't anything in particular. Like there wasn't that big one title announcement or anything that allowed the internet to kind of all talk about that one thing. Instead, there's just this big mesh and mess of possible things to come, which I think is kind of the state of DC right now anyway.
Yeah, and lots of questions. And part of the point of this podcast is we'll have a little bit of what our view is. And hopefully these things will come out. We'll be able to review and talk about them and say what we think.
Yeah. Yeah, and something we want as well is ideas, advice. What do you want to hear us talk about? We could also give out what we think good reading could be. So, for example, if we gave out some reading suggestions in the run up to a film or a show, talk about that. What would we recommend? How do we get into comics? I really want us to have one episode discussing the state of comic books and this comic book industry. That's something I'm really excited to talk about. We have a lot of ideas. We won't get into them now. There are more to come.
We will. Really good. I think we might be on to the last segment, which is my favorite planned segment, Jacob, which is my dadvice.
Oh yes.
You might have thought
is that the
about
final
this,
name?
This is the bit I'm going to put most of my work into. So this is where I have done some research. I'm going to pick up my dadvice is going to come from Thor God of Thunder, the kind of Gore the God Butcher one. And come now, Norseman, why stand we here with the dead when we've got a long house filled with cold mead and warm women? That's
that's your dadvice for the episode.
My dadvice for this week is, why stand around and do nothing? You should go and find somewhere with mead and women. Maybe this is not the best dad advice I've ever given. Maybe I need to review the segment slightly.
Yeah, but that's why we're recording this one after hours.
And also, we probably won't tell your mum that was the advice I gave as well. We'll just make sure she doesn't listen to the end of this segment.
I'd be surprised if she made it all the way through.
I don't think she'll get 4 minutes in.
I agree. And that's why we're doing this.
We might just not send her. We just won't tell her. We won't send her.
Yeah, exactly. It's fine.
I'll come up with better advice next time, but it's going to come from the reading shelves.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
And it also won't be serious as well.
Archive of knowledge.
Yeah.
Oh, that one wasn't serious.
Well, not really. I mean, I don't really want you to go out and look for cold mead and warm women, but
cheers, Dad.
And if you do so, you should do it in a safe way, which would be the dadvice around.
Okay, and that is the end of our podcast. Thank you for listening very much. If you have bothered to get this far in, this is Dad Made a Nerd. I think that's the title we're setting on, and we will have social medias. There's an Instagram that we'll link, and you'll be able to follow. Search me up on JGreaves2 on Instagram, and my review account is linked in the bio there at JReviews, where you can follow lots of film and TV reviews from me if you want a bit more detail on them or little summaries. Do you want them to? How do people follow you? Do you want people to follow you?
I think people don't need to follow me. I think they should follow you. Your film reviews are a real kind of thing that we'll probably talk about, and And we could probably do these on a weekly basis, and we'll have some more stuff to talk about with more comics, more films, more
Mm.
nerd stuff. And thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, and if you do follow, I will make my dad try and work out how to make Instagram stories on the dad made a nerd pod Instagram. So that's an incentive there alone.
Stuff. Thank you.